Hi, International Grandmaster Ron W. Henley here, and welcome to OnlineChessLessons.net. Today's continued coverage is from Round 3 of the 2012 World Chess Olympiad, currently being played in Istanbul, Turkey. Today's game features a match from the US versus Venezuela, and in fact, Board 4, young Grandmaster Ray Robson, one of America's newest, brightest talents, against international master Julio Astos. Ray starts out with 1 e4. Astos plays 1 e6. I first saw Julio Astos in the 1976 World Youth Olympic team, where he had a phenomenal score of like 8 wins and 1 loss. And it turned out that in studying his games, his wins were mostly with the white pieces. And so it occurred to me he was one of those players who with white is a much stronger player than with black. And you come across this from time to time in international play. I was fortunate to play him a year or two later and win a crucial game with black in a G6 Ruy Lopez in one of my first international tournament victories in a small city, Tunja, Colombia. So in today's game, though, he picks the French defense, which is referred to by Albert and Jinjin Hashvili as, quote, one of black's light square defenses. They talk about this in their most excellent Chess Openings for White Explained. So after d4, and their point is that after d5, black erects a light square central pawn structure. And of course, after pawn takes pawn, he's able to replace, with the e-pawn and maintain a post in the center on the light squares. Anyway, though, white plays knight c3, protecting the pawn, developing a piece, and after d takes e4, this, of course, is the Blackburn variation. Note that knight f6 would be the classical variation, and bishop to b4 would be the Winawer variation, also both very popular. But d takes e4, knight takes e4, knight to d7 brings us to the Blackburn variation. And of course, this is named after Joseph Blackburn, known as, quote, the Black Death. Since around the turn of the century, for about 50 years, he was actually England's #1 player. This was back around the 1900s. In my book on the World Chess Champion Tactics, I actually look at some of his classic, brilliant attacking queen sacrifices. So the point, though, with knight d7 is that black prepares to play knight f6, challenge the centralized white knight, and on knight takes knight, he's able to recapture with, quote, the replacement knight. So knight d7 was very popular. It's considered very solid, and Ulf Andersson played it with some success in the 80s, and in more recent times, Morozevich has brought it back into prominence. So let's see, white continues development, and after knight to f6, white plays bishop g5. It should be noted that white's most popular is to take on f6. This has been played, of course, by Kasparov and Anand, and after knight takes f6, we see black's idea. Kasparov and Anand have both played bishop to d3 as well. But bishop g5, developing, pinning the knight on f6, certainly nothing wrong with that. Now black plays h6. A more solid approach is probably bishop e7, forcing the exchange of some minor pieces, and after knight takes f6, bishop takes f6, bishop takes, knight takes. Well, white still has a little more space here in the center, but keep in mind, in a cramped position, black has managed to exchange 2 pairs of minor pieces. And so, of course, that greatly reduces white's prospects for any kind of kingside attack. So coming back after bishop g5, black plays h6. After knight takes f6, knight takes f6, the bishop has to move. But note, instead of knight takes f6, the usual way for white to fight for the advantage is to gain time by surrendering the bishop with bishop takes f6, knight takes f6, and then perhaps bishop to d3, simply defending. In this type of position, black has the 2 bishops, okay? But white still has more space, slight edge in development, and can play plans like c3, queen c2, queen e2, castle, or possibly castle queenside. Very sharp play. In the game, after h6, as we mentioned, Robson captured with the knight on f6. and after knight takes, back the bishop up to h4. Bishop to e3 probably deserved consideration. And now black struck at the center with c5. Interestingly enough, Fritz offers up a pretty thematic resource that Morozevich has played a number of times. Fritz suggests queen d5. What's the idea here? Well, let's say white continues normal development. Then you play something like bishop d7, queen e2, and then castle. And Fritz considers that this is quite okay for black. And this is what appeals to Morozevich when he plays these positions, because he manages to create this tremendous dynamic imbalance while maintaining a solid position. Back to the game after c5, striking at the white center, Robson makes an interesting choice here. He plays bishop to c4. Note that bishop to b5 check, bishop d7, takes, queen e2 is possible, and after c takes d4 castles. White does get a bit of lead in development, but after bishop e7, rook d4, queen c6, black's pretty solid. He's ready to castle. He's going to have counterplay on the c file and on the queen side. And note the knight from f3 can't move forward without worrying about dropping the pawn on g2 in some cases. Very thematic play. But Ray plays bishop c4, and after c takes d4, simply castles. Not worrying about the pawn or the material, as it were, he plays for total mobilization of his forces. Note that the routine recapture queen takes d4, queen d4, knight d4, bishop d7 is a very good move, and this is a very well-known French defense endgame that is completely equal for black. In fact, Grandmasters Short and Sarwan have even won such position throughout their careers with black. For example, knight b5, rook c8 is a very important resource black has to understand. So going back, Ray castles. And now black plays queen b6. And this may be the first sign of going wrong. A more solid approach would be simply to play bishop e7, preparing to castle. White will get the pawn back one day, black will complete his development, and life goes on. Another approach would be bishop c5, developing a piece. And then after queen e2, play could be very similar to the game. Again, white has a lead in development. But after queen b6, Ray now plays queen e2. Possibly stronger was knight d4, where white simply has a clear lead in development with absolutely no risk. For example, bishop c5, take on f6, play knight back to b3, that masks off the attack on the b2 pawn, threatens the bishop, and after, say, bishop e7, queen h5, or bishop d7, queen h5, we can see the bishop is attacked, the queen keeps an eye on the h6, the f7 pawns. Keeping an eye on the f7 pawn is important because it makes it more challenging for black to castle queenside. This type of position would offer white a clear advantage, a positional advantage, with absolutely no risk. But Ray, not worried about material, develops his queen, connects his rooks, prepares to centralize. And here, black plays a6. But going back one moment, let's just take a look. What if black tries to snatch this pawn on b2? Well, in this particular situation, it's a bit too dangerous. Bishop to b5 check, bishop d7, bishop takes f6, and the problem he faces here is that when he takes on b5, white has the thunderbolt, knight takes e6. After queen takes, knight check, king up, rook check, and it's just a house cleaning operation. So after queen e2, black plays a6, covering the b5 check and contemplating taking on b2. But in his effort to prevent bishop to b5 check, black loses valuable time. What should he do instead of playing a6? Well, development. This is what black's lacking, so let's get developed. Let's not worry about bishop to b5 check because you now have two choices. You could play king f8, And after rook d1, play a6, and grab this pawn with pretty equal play. In this situation, black has an extra pawn. He's still behind in development, but white has to prove he's got the goods. And white's queen side's also a bit split up. The other possibility after bishop to b5 check, if you don't have the stomach for grabbing the pawn, is you could simply interpose the bishop. And after bishop takes, knight takes, bishop takes, king takes, rook at f to d1. Again, give back the pawn, very basic Steinitz principle, return the material, and complete your development for full equality. On knight f5 check, king simply ducks back to f8. You're completely developed. 3 minor pieces have been exchanged. Pretty much no problem for black at all here. But going back, black spent a valuable tempo here with a6, and notice he still has all these pieces that he hasn't developed. Robson continues to mobilize, and now black should seriously consider playing queen takes b2. For example, after rook d4, bishop e7, rook d1, queen a3, knight e5, castles. Well, after bishop d3, white has tremendous development, and he will target the black king, but again, white has to deliver. So going back after the critical loss of time with a6, bishop c5, rook at f to e1. Now here, rook d3 was quite a strong attacking continuation. But rook at f to e1, bishop d7, and now again rook d3, queen e5 are both quite okay for white, but Ray plays knight e5. Very powerful looking move, focusing in on f7, d7, and opening up for the queen to swing to the king side. Black should now play rook d8. Again, he needs to get some of his forces into the game. Instead, he plays bishop to b5, naively thinking he's going to simply exchange off one of white's key attacking pieces and have a very solid position. However, reality strikes in the form of queen f3, zeroing in on the weak f6 point. In the game, black took on c4. If he tries to bolster the point with bishop e7, then he runs into bishop takes f6, g takes f6, and then the splat, knight takes f7, destroys his defenses. Notice this exploits the e6 point, because the bishop ran away. King takes, rook takes, and it gets ugly quick. For example, queen takes e6, you have queen h5 check, and bishop takes. Notice also that instead of g takes, if he plays bishop takes, the same motif. Knight takes, king takes, rook takes, queen takes, and queen b7 check. And after bishop takes and rook e1 check, it's all over. So this queen f3 was just a very powerful, crushing, and I guess we could probably say winning move by young Ray Robson on simply move 15. Totally being rewarded for mobilizing his pieces and not worrying about material. So after bishop takes c4, Robson now captures on f6, and on bishop d5, little intermezzo there to attack the queen, swings in with queen h5. Now in the game, black plays queen c7. But note, of course, taking on f6 is not possible because check and mate. Let's take a quick look. Instead of the queen c7 defending f7, had he played g6. Well, then I imagine the simple knight takes, pawn takes, and queen takes should be pretty deadly. e6 point is threatened. The rook on h8 is threatened. Black can pretty much resign there. So in the game, after the shot queen h5, queen back to c7, he now hits him with knight takes f7 check. Well, check to the rook on h8, that is. Black now plays king f8. But of course, his best chance for survival was queen takes f7, queen takes d5, castles, queen takes c5, and on queen f6, queen d4, white is a solid pawn ahead, lead in development, better pawn structure, pretty much a technical case. Again in the game he played king f8. The cute looking castle, trying to pin up these pieces on the f-file, runs into the haymaker, knight takes h6 check. Of course if you take that, queen check and mate. So after knight h6 check, king h7, white has the nifty knight f7 check, king back, queen check, king up, queen check, and the skewer nets the queen. So after the shot, knight takes f7, black tried to hang on with king f8. However, after knight takes, pawn takes, we can see black has emerged a full exchange ahead, and the black king is still pretty exposed. Here, Ray continues the theme of mobilization and lifts his rook, preparing to come over to g3. He could of course opt for queen takes h6, queen g7, knight g6 check rescuing the knight, queen takes, and knight f4 with a completely technically won game. Basically he's a pawn in the exchange up, and e6 is probably falling. But going back to the game, Ray played rook d3, and that brought about resignation. This was the first decisive game in the USA versus Venezuela match, and pretty much set the tone for a 3.5 to 1/2 US victory, which catapulted them into the early lead in the 2012 World Chess Olympiad. Again, I'm International Grandmaster Ron W. Henley, and thank you for joining us here for OnlineChessLessons.net.